Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about reproductive isolation. Okay, go into a little bit more detail, and in this video I'll be bringing up disruptive selection, which some of you have been asking about. Okay, so reproductive isolation happens when you've got a population that is split into, well, two populations, one species, multiple populations. Okay, and there is no gene flow between those populations. They've become reproductively isolated from each other. Okay, and you guys have a classic example live, right now happening in London, where we've only in the last 30, 40 years or so, there's been a population gradually growing of parakeets. Okay, so we've got a parakeet population that's spreading through the southeast of the UK here, and then natural ranges in the sort of southern Asia underneath the Himalayas or south of the Himalayas here. Okay, so they've escaped from pet shops and pet owners and the like, and they're doing well in London. They're able to survive in London. There's no gene flow between them. There's no way an animal can get from one population to another population. So we've got no gene flow, and therefore they're reproductively isolated. Okay, and then what will happen is that the direction that the allele frequencies go in will be different in the two different groups. This population's allele frequencies are going in one direction, and the Indian population's in another direction. Okay, so eventually you're going to get what we call speciation. Okay, reproductive isolation leads to speciation. Okay, speciation follows from reproductive isolation. Okay, I mean, it might even be that this lot here, nothing changes in India, which isn't going to be true, but imagine it is, and these guys are undergoing stabilizing selection for all their phenotypes, which isn't going to be true, but anyway, let's pretend that it is. Okay, that doesn't matter, because this lot won't be undergoing stabilizing selection because it's not, the environment here in the UK is not the same as it is here in southern Asia. So these guys here are going to be doing directional selection. The alleles that confer reproductive success in this population are going to be passed on into the next generation, and they're not going to be the same alleles that were found back in the ancestral population here. Okay, notice that ancestors don't have to be dead. Okay, this is an ancestral population, so we see directional selection here as the parakeets adapt to the conditions here in London. Now, this is important that you get your head around, right? Parakeet population adapts. Okay, the parakeets, individual parakeets like this bird here, right? They don't adapt. Okay, you're stuck with the alleles that you were given. That's it. There's nothing you can do about that. Okay, so you can't adapt. An organism does not adapt to its environment. The population adapts, because what really is adapting, of course, is the gene pool. It is the gene pool that adapts to the environment, not the organism. Okay, the organism can't. Okay, only the gene pool can. So, what I was saying here is that even if we've got stabilizing selection happening in this lot, we're going to have directional selection happening in this lot, and eventually you're going to get speciation. The phenotypes that you see in one population won't be the same as the phenotypes you see in the other population. Okay, now this is happening because of the reproductive isolation that follows, usually from sort of changes in physical geography, right? So we've got, what's causing this? Well, changes in physical geography can cause it. So, we're talking over very long timescales. Now, in this case, that's not what's happened. In this case, we physically brought them to the UK and we released them, but that's not what's happened, obviously, historically on planet Earth. Usually it's down to changes in physical geography. Could be that a river changes direction and bisects an area. Could be that a mountain range forms. It could be the tectonic plates are drifting. Okay, but remember, it doesn't have to be changes in physical geography. It can also be down to changes in climate. All right, changes in climate. Okay, if you've got something, I don't know, like a large forest, so we're looking down on this big forested area. Okay, and then the climate changes, maybe it dries up a little bit, and the forest sort of starts to get cleared and it fragments, right? Fragmentation, I've talked about it before. It's really key it's really significant today because of the way that we're destroying habitats. We're breaking up wild habitat into little pockets here and there. But climate can do that too. And then any organisms that were living in this forest are now reproductively isolated from ones living in that forest. Okay? It could be that you've got, a mountain range, right? You've got some mountains here, and you've got a species that's mountain adapted that lives on these mountains, and then, climate warms up and the grass level, the sort of tree line, as we call it, was down here. This gradually comes up the mountain. More, organisms come with it. And then those organisms that were living up in the mountains, they're now reproductively isolated. These guys here can't get gene flow because they can't move through this habitat here because there's competitors down here that can outcompete them, that are more specialist at living in these forested areas, okay? So reproductive isolation can follow from changes in physical geography or changes in climate. But it doesn't have to, okay? You don't need to physically separate the population to two separate populations in order to get reproductive isolation. You can get reproductive isolation in one place, okay? Here is a really nice example of that. These are what we call cactus finches. Okay, two different species, Geospisa scandens and Geospisa magnatricis. Now, they both feed on seeds and they both live in the Galapagos Islands, so they share a habitat, but they are after different food sources. Okay? Historically, there would have been one population. Okay, so if we have a look at the frequency of an allele, and it's the beaks, right? You can see they've got different beaks. This guy's got this little beak, this guy's got this big beak. All right. Sorry, my tables are rocking. You can probably hear that, can't you? Put my foot in it. Right, so we need to maybe look at what happened with these populations. Okay, so we've got our original normal distribution here. Okay, for our beaks. Now, don't go thinking beak size, right? We're not going to write size down here, right? How are you measuring size? You're talking about length, you're talking about mass. I mean, what are you talking about? The thing that's important here is to do with the way they use the beaks. It's the force that the beaks can generate. Okay, beak force, that's a scientific measurable quantity. We measure it in newtons, right? And obviously, Geospisa magnatricis is able to generate a larger bite force than Geospisa scandens. Okay, so they're accessing different sorts of food. Geospisa scandens is after small seeds. Geospisa magnatricis is after big seeds. Okay, these are specialists at digging out and getting the small seeds. Magnatricis is a specialist at getting the big seeds. Now, if this is your normal distribution for the beak force, right, and if you've got a shortage of seeds, then you've got a problem. Because all these guys here, they're all after one type of seed. Okay, they're all able to get through the middle sort of size seeds, and so you've got competition, intra-specific competition. competition. Which means that these guys here are competing with each other. Now, these guys here out on the edge, they're not getting competition, and they're not getting competition. Okay? So you're got an unusual situation where your extremes are more likely to experience reproductive success than your ones in the middle. Hang on, let me shut that door. So, when we come back and have a look at what has happened after a while, then these guys here, their reproductive success has dropped. Okay, whereas these guys here, they might have passed on more alleles, so the frequency of these alleles has increased. Okay, and so now we start to see a allele frequency that looks like this, and then after a bit longer, maybe it starts to look like this, until eventually you get to the point where you've got this lot and this lot. Okay? Them and them. We call this disruptive selection. Disruptive selection. Okay? Now, that means that we're able to have these guys speciate in the same place. These guys eventually will speciate in two different places, but these guys can speciate in the same place. Okay? And whether speciation happened in one place, like here, and happened because of disruptive selection, or whether it happened in two places and happened because of directional selection being different in those two places, it matters. It matters to biologists, right? So we have two different terms that we use. Okay, so if it's disruptive selection and the two species that you end up with speciated from an ancestral form in one place, we describe that as being sympatric. Sympatric speciation. Okay, sim meaning together. Okay, same, right? Sympathy, right? Symbiotic. Okay, so that's what this prefix sim means. All right, so that's same place, patrick place, patriotism. Yeah, another word with the same roots, right? So same place. And then with our parakeets here, these are going to be in two different places, and the word for different is allo, believe it or not, right? So this is allopatric, different place, allopatric speciation. Okay, so you've got sympatric speciation, where reproductive isolation happens in one place, and allopatric speciation, where it happens in two different places. Okay, so allopatric speciation often follows from, reproductive isolation, that's caused by changes in physical geography or changes in climate, physically dividing the population in two, whereas sympatric speciation results from disruptive selection in one place. Okay? These guys are worth exploring for a little bit longer. So this is Tiaris obscura. Okay? This is another finch. All right, now you can see this one has slightly greener colouring. Okay, this one is a forest-dwelling bird rather than being out on the Galapagos. Now the Galapagos are volcanic islands. You might notice, and so they're quite, the earth and the rock is very dark, and these birds are quite dark. Okay, whereas these guys here, this Tiaris obscura is a forest bird. It's a bit smaller and it's green. Okay. Turns out that Tiaras obscura is the ancestor of G. scandens and G. magnatrices. Okay, Tiaras obscura lives here in Ecuador. Okay, and the two Geospizas live here in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, if we do our kind of having a look at the sort of parents of these guys, a bit like the sort of assembly idea that we had, right? So there's his, mum and his nan and his great nan and his great great nan, his great 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 nan, and little back down the road all the way through time, right? And here's Geospiza scandens, and there's all his, representatives from his ancestry. Eventually, you get to a point there where you've got common ancestors. Okay, all of these down here are what we would call common ancestors. They're common ancestors. All right. So all of these guys here are the ancestors of both Geospiza scandens and Geospiza magnatrices. Okay. This one here is the last common ancestor. Okay, because everyone after that is separate. So disruptive selection occurred, and then eventually we got to a point where these were two different species. Okay, if I keep going, back in time, eventually, here's Tiara obscura's ancestor. Eventually we get to another last common ancestor, this guy. This guy here, oh no, you're not that one. That one is the last common ancestor of both Geospizas and T. obscura. Okay, how do we know this? Well, because we look at the genes, right? We look at the DNA base sequences, and we look at the RNA sequences, and we look at the amino acid sequences, and we see, okay, which bird out there can we find that is the most similar to the Geospizas? Okay, and it's this guy, Tiara obscura. Okay, what would have happened is some of these would have been, flying around in a storm and they get blown out to sea. Okay, and this happens all the time, right? We have, these great big oil tankers that are going around the coast here, and it happens regularly. These little birds turn up and get blown over, blown onto the island, blown onto the boats from these things, right? And they're the lucky ones, of course. They land somewhere. Lots of them get blown out to sea and drown. Okay, one of these types of birds got blown out to sea here and settled on the islands, lucky enough to land on the islands, and either it was pregnant and laid eggs, or there was a little flock of them, blown out there, a few different ones blown out there one time, and they were able to breed, and off they go. Okay. The Galapagos are quite far from Ecuador. It's interesting. There's lots of reptiles here, famously big giant tortoises, and there's an aquatic iguana a marine iguana that we can look at. No mammals though, and that's because for the reptiles to get there, they had to kind of get carried on logs or whatever out to sea to get there. But reptiles can go without eating for months on end. Not mammals though; they need to eat all the time, and so any mammals that were blown out to sea, they don't make it that far. So anyway, there you go. That's interesting. So we've got these guys here undergoing disruptive selection. Meanwhile, this guy here has been presumably undergoing directional selection. I very much doubt that this guy here looks any more like T. obscura than it does look like Geospiza genus. Okay? There will have been a gradual change in allele frequency happening here, just like there was happening here and here. Okay? All right, so we were talking about sympatric speciation. Okay, so Geospiza magnatrices and Geospiza scandens have been undergoing sympatric speciation. Okay, but they've also, from that point there, been undergoing allopatric speciation from T. obscura, right? Because they got physically separated to the Galapagos Islands back here, whenever this time point was in history. They got separated, they got blown over to that island, and so they were allopatrically speciating from that point on, and then eventually, because of the intra-specific competition, they underwent disruptive selection and became two different species rather than one different species. That was this Galapagos finch. Okay, if that sort of rings a bell, the Galapagos finches, that's because they're very famous. Darwin brought some back himself. You can go to the Natural History Museum and you can see the ones that he brought back, and they've still got the little tags which have his handwriting kind of tied to their feet. Okay. There are several different ways you can end up with sympatric speciation. All right. So it could be that you've got something different about the timing that you have. Okay, and we call anything to do with timing temporal. Okay, so one type of disruptive selection, one type of isolating mechanism. Ooh, we're doing help. One type of isolating mechanism could be temporal isolation. Okay, so it's a type of reproductive isolation. It's to do with timing. All right, so you've got lots of different bumblebees. I would hope, have paid enough attention to have noticed that they're not the same all summer long. Right, if you looked up from your phone for a minute, you might notice that you have different types of bee, different types of summer, different times in the summer. Okay, the big buff-tailed ones with a white tail tend to appear later in the year, and the ones that are out now don't have that white end on them. Okay, there's also a red-ended one as well. Okay, so, keep a lookout. Okay, and we've got the early bumblebee, Bombus pretorum, and the buff-tailed bumblebee, Bombus terrestris. And you can see here, okay, this is just the number of bees that are out. Okay, so this isn't the allele frequency, but it's the number of bees that are out and about. And you can see that they've divided up the summer into, the early bee is out and it peaks kind of sort of late May, early June, and then the later bee, the buff-tail, comes out and it's got a sort of population peak around July, and therefore they're not competing for the food, the nectar, and the pollen that they're after. Okay, so this is due to differences in mating season. You can also get differences in hibernation patterns, differences in the time that you're out feeding. Okay, it doesn't have to be to do with mating seasons, but if it's to do with the timing, they've divided up the time, then it's temporal. And you can imagine how this has happened because of disruptive selection. They would all been out at once there, and then there's competition here for the flowers. These guys have out-competed, been competing with each other, and you've ended up with a bunch of bees that are out here and a bunch of bees that are out there. Disruptive selection. Okay, here's another one. This is a very famous example. So this is called a railroad worm, right? It's not a worm. It's it's the maggot of these flies that's called the worm. Okay, it's a pest. That's why it's known as it's the maggot that people name. It's in America. This is in the USA, right? And this thing lives on these berries. They're called hawthorn berries. We have hawthorn in this country as well. It's not quite the same thing. It's American hawthorn, right? And apples were introduced in the 1800s. And since then, we've seen speciation, okay? Because they have preferences about where they lay their eggs, okay? Lots of them are competition to lay them on the hawthorns, so you've got to lay in all your little eggs on the hawthorns, all right? And some of them started laying on apples. One of them started laying on apples. This guy, no competition, out he comes, all of his offspring are born. They also have their same tendency. They lay on apples as well. And you've ended up with disruptive selection. Differences in feeding preference. Okay, these guys are feeding on the hawthorn and then they lay their eggs on the hawthorn. These guys are feeding on the apples and they lay their eggs on the apples. And you end up with apple specialists and hawthorn specialists. Okay, another example of disruptive selection. Okay, now in this case, we would call the last one we called it temporal. This is what we would say is ecological isolation. This is to do with their environment, right? The way that they feed. Okay, or it could be to do with the way their choice of nesting site, or the choice of prey that they attack, or whatever like that. So you can end up with ecological isolating mechanisms. Okay. And you can end up with behavioral as well, all right? And this is a really famous example of behavioral isolation. Right, so we've got behavioral isolation, we've got ecological isolation, we've got temporal isolation, different types of reproductive isolation that are sympatric, okay? And so you get disruptive selection, and then you get speciation that is sympatric, okay? This one is maybe need a little bit more explaining. So cichlids are a type of fish. If you've got a fish tank at home, you might well have cichlids in them. They're that sort of fish. They're brightly coloured. There's a huge array of different types of cichlids, okay? And this is to do with courtship behaviour. So they use the colours in courtship behaviour. Well, the depth that you're at has is going to affect the effectiveness of your coloration. Some colours penetrate deeper than other colours in water. Okay, the different colours make more difference the further down you are. So you've ended up with this kind of split where these shallow water breeders are better off if they're blue, and the deep water breeders are better off if they're red. So you've ended up with speciation, disruptive selection, because of courtship behaviour. Okay, where it is that they're doing their courtship dances. If they're doing it in shallow water, then they're better off if they're blue. If they're doing it in deep water, then they're better off if they're red. Okay, so this is a behavioural isolating mechanism. Interestingly, cichlids are from Lake Victoria in Africa. Okay, or is it Lake Macquarie? I can't remember. Anyway, some big lake, right? And it's a relatively new lake. So this lake wasn't there, and then it formed, right? Great big lake as ice age receded, right? And the cichlids got in. Now, it was brand new. There was very few fish in there, okay? And an ancestral cichlid got in, and then it was party time, right? There was so many different niches. Lots of niches were available in here, and the cichlids ended up undergoing disruptive selection to fill all sorts of different niches. Okay, we call it radiation, right? They radiated out into all sorts of different types. Okay, so I might put something up and you can have a look at that yourself. So this is behavioural. We've also seen ecological and temporal, which is time related, yeah. And there's one more you can have, mechanical. I mean, there are others as well, but these tend to be the ones that are most likely to be, useful to you in a mark scheme sort of sense. And mechanical would be the mechanics of reproduction, right? So if you've got, a big fish, a little fish, then are they going to be able to reproduce and produce fertile offspring? Actually, fish is a bad example because they don't have penetrative sex anyway. They just females just drop their eggs in the water and then the males just gush their sperm into the water, and fertilization happens like that. But imagine you're a big dog, little dog kind of situation, all right? There's going to be a mechanical problem there, right? You're not going to be able to get reproduction happening, and so you've got this mechanical isolation. Okay, and eventually you end up with speciation. All right, so that's what happened here with these guys. Okay, eventually you're going to get either gamete incompatibility, Okay, so the sperms and the eggs are no longer compatible. So that's what finally finishes off your ability to breed and produce fertile offspring. All right, so then you are officially two different species. Or it might be that you get hybrid infertility, where you can produce offspring, but it's not fertile. All right, and so therefore you're effectively two different species, right? Because every time you cross, nothing happens. Okay, because you get a hybrid, but it's infertile. Okay, or you get hybrid inviability. If something's inviable in biology, it means it can't survive. Inviability. Okay, so the sperm can fertilize the egg, but at some point during the embryonic development, it fails. Okay, so once you've got these in place, then you have speciated. Okay, but it takes ages. Okay, this is a nanulac, right? Or a pisley is what the Americans call it. But pisley was obviously polar bear grizzly. Nanulac is the same thing, but in the Inuit languages. Okay, it's where you take the part of the name of one and part of the name of the other. There's rules about it. It depends on the male goes first. So a pisley is a male polar bear and a female grizzly. A growler is a female grizzly and a male polar bear, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know that. I don't even know why I'm telling you that. So, but nanulac is just a much nicer term for them. Okay, and they're pretty rare, but they're not that rare. There's like 8 recorded so far outside of zoos. And there's at least one case where one was fertile, right? It was able to itself reproduce with grizzlies. Okay, so we think polar bears and grizzly bears speciated sometime relatively recently, maybe 100,000 years ago or so. I mean, that's pretty recent. I mean, we're newcomers, and humans have been looking like this for 200,000 years. So these polar bears are relative newcomers. They're going to have a very brief time on planet Earth. Obviously, with the ice caps melting. So, but this speciation has to be in place for a very long time before you completely speciate. Lions and tigers are geographically isolated. They haven't always been. We tend to think of lions as living in Africa, but that's because we killed all the lions apart from the ones that live in Africa. Okay, elephants live in Africa and India. Well, no, elephants lived all across Europe, all across Southern Asia, all through Arabia. We just killed all the others. Okay, there's just a couple of pockets left. There's the ones in India. There's the ones in Africa. Okay, and if you've got Netflix, you might have seen that mental show about the tiger keepers, and there are more captive tigers in America than there are in the wild. And they're breeding, they're crossing them all the time. They cross jaguars with lions and tigers with lions and tigers with panthers and whatever. Okay, because they haven't been reproductively isolated for so long that you've completely achieved gamete incompatibility or hybrid infertility or hybrid inviability. Okay, you need these to have happened to have completely speciated. Okay, so you try and cross a polar bear with a panda bear. They've been reproductively isolated for the population that's led to grizzlies and polar bears, and then you've got your pandas. Well, that's a very, very long time ago, that common ancestor. And there's been enough mutation and accumulation over time between these guys and these guys that they can't reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so there's your sympatric speciation, your allopatric speciation, and this idea of disruptive selection. Hope all that made sense. God, that's a long video. Sorry, I was waffling.